Hello, everybody. I had no idea what was going to happen this evening. I thought that I might be speaking to hundreds of people in a very large library. Had I known that it was going to be this intimate, number one, I wouldn't have worn so much makeup. And number two, I might have dressed down somewhat. You know, I feel that I'm overdressed. But still, do you think I look pretty, kids? Yeah. Do you? Do you think I look very pretty? Because I did try very, very hard. I didn't even know you were going to be here, so I'm very excited to have the four of you here. Now, you have chosen a book. Each of you, I mean, you know, one of the boys has chosen a book and one of the girls has chosen a book, which is very fair. And I would therefore like the kids, if you don't mind, let's all rearrange ourselves, okay? I will move my chair here, if that's okay with you. Is that okay with you? No? A little bit this way. How is that? Is that perfect? We have to ask the man over there because he's in charge of very important matters. So then you come and sit here on the floor, if you don't mind, because then you'll be able to see the pictures. Because if you don't sit on the floor, how on earth will you see the pictures? It will be such a waste of a visit to the library, won't it? I should hope so. And you chose the first book, didn't you? You did. That's so exciting. I'm very pleased. The very first book is a book from Australia. Did you know that's where I live?
Yeah.
Yeah? Did you know I live in Australia?
Yeah.
I know you don't think so, but it is the best country in the world. I'm on your tape? You have an audio tape of me telling stories? That's so exciting. Boys, do you know where Australia is?
No.
Right at the bottom of the world. When you look at a big globe of the world, a big, you know, one of those things that goes round and round, and you see the world on it, you go shoo, and just about here is Australia. So you go shoo, and there's Australia. Do you know what the shape of Australia is? Sort of like that. And see where my thumbs are? That's where I live. In the middle, at the bottom, in a city called Adelaide, which is very beautiful. Like the whole of Australia. Koalaloo, here we go. You know this is what a koala looks like. You know that, don't you?
Yeah.
Yes? They're so adorable. Completely adorable. Although, of course, she did. Every night, as Koalaloo curled up under the stars, she remembered the times when her mother had looked at her and said, "Koalaloo, I do love you." And she longed for her mother to say it again. One night, Koalaloo had a splendid idea. Preparations had begun for the Bush Olympics. She would enter the Bush Olympics, she would enter the gum tree climbing event, and she would win, and then her mother would fling her arms around her face, fling her arms around her and say again, "Koalaloo, I do love you." Fine. That's fine. Koalaloo would reply. Koala Claus had also entered the gum tree climbing. And everyone knew how fast she was. But Koalaloo wasn't scared. She saw her mother's face in the crowd and imagined her saying again, "Koalaloo, I do love you." But she wasn't fast enough. In spite of all her hoping, in spite of all her training, it was Koala Claus who won the gum tree climbing. Koalaloo came second. Koalaloo went off and hid. She heard the shouts from the Bush Olympics and cried her heart out. When the first stars of evening appeared in the sky, Koalaloo crept home through the dark and up into the gum tree where her mother was waiting for her. And I always will. And she hugged her for a very, long time. Book number 1, and you survived. None of you cried. That was very, very good. Absolutely excellent. I didn't look at the grown-ups because some of them cry over that story. You don't want to look at them in case they've got tears in their eyes, okay? And this is the second story. Who chose this story? You did. What's your name? Carl. Thank you very much for choosing this story, Carl. This book is called Whoever You Are. I'm sorry I'm only reading you 2 books, but I have to talk to the grown-ups afterwards, okay? All right? Sorry about that. That's why we've only got 2 books, but you look big enough to read by yourselves, so you can just go off and do some reading by yourself after this. Do you want to read one of my books? It's very short. You watch. See how quickly we get through it. Little one, whoever you are, wherever you are in this big wide world, there are little ones just like you all over the world. Thank you. You have to go, and I'm staying. Thank you very much for listening so beautifully. It was very nice. Thank you. Do you know, because there are so few of us, would you mind coming to the front so that we can just have a gossip rather than my doing a speech? You can stay there, that's fine. But if the rest come to the front, so that it's more like as if we're sitting in a sitting room in our own house, you know, even though I would never look like this in my own house. Just imagine me in jammies and slippers, and then we'll get on fine. We'll get on just fine. I'm just going to readjust what I was going to say and just chat, of course, because, you know, I have a speech. Who wants a speech with this audience? It would be embarrassing, wouldn't it? It would be extremely embarrassing. So I'm just going to chat. But I'll keep my notes here because they're good. And if I forget something, well, I can go back to that. I can go back to them. My talk is called The Power of the Story, How Reading Aloud to Our Children Will Change Their Lives Forever. And those of us in the world who are interested in literacy may fight huge battles about how children are taught to read once they get to school. But once children are born and before they go to school, all of us, experts around the world, people who love children, know about literacy, know that reading aloud to children before they go to school does indeed change their lives forever. We all know that. We all agree on that one thing. And that's where my life has begun to be focused. I used to teach teachers. For 24 years I taught teachers, and I loved it, and I wept in my last class, and I thought, how can I give this up? But I was teaching people how to teach children who were aged 5 and over. And over the 24 years that I taught and that I worked with kids one-to-one who couldn't read, and then I worked with my own student teachers in classrooms, I thought, you know, this isn't where it starts. It doesn't start here. It starts at home. And we ask so much of teachers. We ask so much of them to teach reading to children who have never had the experience of books or language or songs or rhymes. How can they do it if it hasn't happened before school? If a certain amount of stuff hasn't happened before school? I'm not asking parents to teach their children before school. That is the exact opposite of what I'm saying in my book. At least 10 times I say, do not teach your child to read before school. It may just happen. And if it doesn't just happen by some miracle, which I've never quite worked out, I don't know how they do it, these kids who learn to read before school, but if it doesn't happen, children will learn to read very happily, very easily, and very quickly in their first year at school, if they have been read aloud to before they go to school. There was no father apparent. Obviously there was one, but there was no father on the scene. She had a child 8 years ago, a little boy called Mackie. And on the first day that he was born, I read to him. And I felt slightly foolish, I have to say, with a newborn baby, reading him just a little book. You know, I'm a little teapot, short and stout, you know, that one. And I said to my niece, you know, who I'm quite fond of, in spite of her misbehavior, I said, Tammy, please, will you read to him every day? Just, if you do that, he'll be okay. He'll be fine. It'll help his brain. It'll help his emotional attachment to you. He'll feel comfortable with you, and he will learn to read easily if you do it. He won't learn to read easily if you don't. You could have, it could be hard for him. It takes all types of mothers to make the world. But she herself had had tremendous difficulty learning to read because she herself had not been read aloud to prior to going to school. So her lack of self-esteem about reading, of course she picked it up. Most kids pick it up, whatever the method they're taught. Most kids pick up reading. We have a 20% illiteracy rate, we think, in Australia, which is not bad, compared with the world. 20% sounds terrible. It's not that bad. Most kids pick it up. And so she did pick up reading eventually, but she had a very strong memory of herself at the age of 8 failing in school as a reader. And because she lacked self-esteem as a reader, when they interacted with a book, the tension from her towards the child, in case the child didn't succeed, was so palpable that he failed, basically, because the agenda from her was, you have to learn how to read. Very soon she was trying to make him see things. And the more he couldn't see them, well, he felt her tension, he felt her agenda. The more he couldn't see them, because he was so tense, the more he didn't learn, the more she panicked, the more her self-esteem went down, the more his self-esteem went down. And now, to sit at my mother's kitchen table and listen to her talking about a recent parent-teacher interview, I just went out and I felt like sobbing. I just felt like sobbing because it could have been prevented. Reading problems are so easy to prevent, and they're really hard to fix. They're really hard. They can be fixed, but it's hard work. It's hard work for the teachers, and it's very hard work for the kids. And that whole self-esteem thing, the joy, the delight, I'm a failing reader, I will never enjoy books, I will never enjoy books. I can see that the only time that Mackie loves being read to now, because he's so terrified, even with me, reading professor, great aunt, of course he's terrified of me reading to him because I might say, you finish this sentence, I'm tired, you finish it. The only time he doesn't tremble when a book enters his life is when he's nearly asleep. And then he knows he's safe. He knows that it's just a lulling, rhythmic, delightful, fabulous activity that he's just going to be rocked to sleep by the words, because my sister, who's his grandmother, of course, is now a reformed person, and she does read to him. She reads to him, and he loves it. And one day he said to her, Nana, you didn't read me Koala Loo last night. And she said, yes, I did, sweetheart. You fell asleep. You fell asleep. I promise I read it. So he's positive towards books only when he feels completely safe from being taught. It's heartbreaking. But can you imagine, this kid is my great nephew. I am a reading professor. You can't live other people's lives for them, though, can you? You just can't. So what do I mean by reading aloud to kids before school? Because I keep saying, oh, you've got to read aloud to kids before school, as if it's something horrible. Of course, kids love being read aloud to before school. They adore it, if it's the right kind of atmosphere. They love it, they love it, they love it. I mean, I didn't teach those kids, did I? I just read to them. I just had a good time with them. I just absolutely adored it. We read, because I presume most of us are parents, that we read 3 books a day, every day, to the children in our lives. And when we read those books, it will take us 10 to 15 minutes a day. That's all. 10 to 15 minutes is 1% of the day. I've done the math many times. If we say, and parents say to me, I haven't got time to do that. I haven't got time to spend 15 minutes a day with my kids. But I say, I want to go up to them and say, well, why did you have them then? Why did you have kids if you can't spend 1% of the day focusing on them? Because what happens in that 1% of the day is we're not teaching them how to read. We're involving ourselves with them in wonder. We're just sitting with them and having a most beautiful time. And kids are feeling very comfortable and very flattered because we're spending that time with them. At this moment, she loves me, and I love her, and I love this book that we're reading, and books are fabulous, and I love reading, and I'm going to read one day. And the whole attitude is right for that. Everything happens in the right way, and it's such a delight, such a delight. So, 3 books a day, 15 minutes a day. It's always under 15 minutes. I've done this talk several times. The first line is, far away from here lives a crazy old lady called Daisy O'Grady. Okay? Now, if you opened the book and you said to kids, far away from here lives a crazy lady called Daisy O'Grady. Well, you know, it's not gripping. It's not really gripping. What kind of book are we reading? We're reading for little kids books with rhyme, rhythm, and repetition. Rhymers turn into readers. Kids who come to school not knowing that Fred and bed rhyme find reading excessively difficult. Kids who come to school who know 8 nursery rhymes by the time they're 4, 8 nursery rhymes by heart by the time they're 4, have been found to be the best readers by the time they're 8. The patterning of rhyme, rhythm, and repetition is unbelievably important. Kids learn to remember the tune of the book, okay? It's like a song. They learn to remember the tune. We always read it in exactly the same way, with exactly the same kind of animation. You can actually see the book on a musical stave. There was once a baby koala, so soft and round that all who saw her loved her. You can see it on a musical stave. It's always the same. They then remember it, and because they remember it, and because, the other thing that we're doing is we're doing it, 10 to 15 times a day. We're doing it with animation. We're choosing books with rhyme, rhythm, and repetition, and we are reading the same books over and over and over again in the same tune, so that the kids remember them. Very easy books, very simple books. The kids remember them very easily. They very soon know when to turn the page on the right page. Because if a kid comes to school and doesn't know how to turn a book, doesn't know which way a book goes up or down, doesn't know the kind of stories, the way stories work, has never been introduced to that kind of literary language, of course they're going to find it phenomenally difficult to read. So reading aloud well, reading aloud rhythmically, reading aloud in the same tune, reading aloud the same books over and over again. Oh, it says here, read a book. Okay, I will. It's very short. It's very short, but it introduces my next little section of points. I'll just find a tissue in here. I know there's one here, because it looks so bad to wipe your nose on your sleeve. Okay, here we are. Right. Oh, no, that's not the one. It's this one. Hang on a minute. It's much shorter than that. It's this one. Okay, this book is called Tough Boris. You say Tough Boris. You say Tough Boris, and we say Tough Boris. It's funny, isn't it, accents? They're really funny. I love to listen to them. The reason why we say Tough Boris, this is just of interest to us, as grown-ups. I mean, this is of no interest to my speech whatsoever, is because you divide the word up quite sensibly, as you do orange as well. Some people do orange and Oregon in the same way. You can't see the pictures properly unless you really stare at the book. So I will hold them up, but the artist, given this appallingly simple, dry text, made a wonderful story underneath the words, okay? Nothing to do with me. I didn't ask her to, and she didn't tell me what she was going to do either, so it's absolutely fabulous. Once upon a time, there lived a pirate named Boris Vonderborch. He was tough. All pirates are tough. He was massive. All pirates are massive. He was scruffy. All pirates are scruffy. He was greedy. All pirates are greedy. He was, turn over the page, fearless. All pirates are fearless. He was scary. All pirates are scary. But when his parrot died, he cried and cried All pirates cry. And so do I. Much better read by an elderly man, and I've seen it done, and it's just heart-rending. It's absolutely heart-rending. Now, why do I cry? Well, I'll tell you why I cry, because that book says, and some pirates cry, and so do I. I'll tell you why I cry, but before I do, I need my glasses, because I'm just going to read you a few things, and I don't want to forget any of them. Many of these things I found out. Brain research is going so fast that some of the things that I'm about to tell you, I've only found out since I wrote the book, like even since February, which is so irritating. Some research in Arizona, I could scream that I didn't know. I mean, it just reinforces my case, but it would have been nice to... I actually didn't quote a lot in my book because it was for parents, and because I'm an academic, it took me 3 years to write this book, and 26 drafts. And it started off 66,000 academic words and ended up as a 27,000-word chat between friends. It was so hard to get that voice out because I've written in that fashion all the time. And my editor finally said, you know, no footnotes, you know, very few quotes as possible, no bibliography, nothing. This is a chat, you know, we don't have bibliographies in a chat. I said, oh my God. Okay, I said, right. She said, just your experience. You know, you've been teaching for 24 years, you know this stuff, just say it. Oh, God. So this is what I found out, which I would have put in if she'd let me have real good statistics in there. I'm ashamed to say I only found this out this year because the people I've been talking to say, didn't you know that? Didn't you know that? The brain is only 25% developed before birth. So when a kid is born, it has 25% of its brain. Now, this is fantastic news to us, because it means every kid has a chance. Given that they're born into a normal family where the mother is well, and they're not brain damaged, I mean, every kid has a chance. Doesn't matter where they're born or to whom they're born. This brain is 25% developed, and it's waiting. It's begging for stimulation to be developed. It is begging for smells, it's begging for sounds, it's begging for sight. And every time those senses, the 5 senses are stimulated, the neurons, the little things in the brain, what are they called? There's this word, it's not neurons, it's another thing. Synapses are connecting because they're disconnected, largely disconnected, you know. And we sing to people, and we sing to little kids, and they smell things, and they taste things, and we hug them, and we laugh at them, and we bounce them, and we show them bright pictures in picture books, and we have mobiles in their bedrooms, and their brains are going bananas, absolutely bananas. Their brains are developing. In fact, now that I know a lot about the brain, a lot, she says, you know, I know enough to be anxious about children's development, very anxious. Thank God I didn't know when my child was young and I could be a normal mother, but there you go. Because I think I would be a freak-out mother now. But I see children, knowing that the brain is 75% developed, apparently, by the time children are 3, and that, you know, children's brains are kind of denser if they're stimulated before 3, that more synapses have connected before 3, and that's, you know, it kind of stops. There's a little bit that happens between 3 and 6. There's a little bit that happens after 6, but really, by the time we're 3, that tool that we've got, that blunt or sharp thing, is what we're going to have to use for the rest of our lives. But even worse, really, by the time we're 1. By the time we're 1. Apparently, by the time we're 1, the wires that say how creative, clever, and imaginative we're going to be have already been laid down. So we need to be reading to children from birth to 1 in particular, let alone birth to 5, but birth to 1. Birth to 1. So, let me go on. I've said 2 things already. I've remembered that. That's fantastic. It must be obvious then that the following activities provide stimulation to babies and toddlers and help their brains develop: talking to them, singing to them, reading aloud to them, playing with them, bonding with them through hugs and kisses, and clapping games and bouncy rhymes. The brain of a 1-year-old, apparently, is more like the brain of an adult than it is like the brain of a newborn child. The brain of a 1-year-old is more like the brain of a grown-up than it is like the brain of a newborn child. So much so that when I now am in a supermarket or a doctor's waiting room or in an airport and I see an unstimulated child under 1, someone who's just sitting in a pram, sort of just, you know, like this, or why should parents expect children to behave when they've got nothing to do? Do you know what I mean? It is mind-boggling that children should behave when there's nothing to do. Anyway, when they sit there unstimulated and they're under 1, I think that is a brain that is not being developed. I don't mind if they're eating, and I don't mind if they're sleeping. Children who come to school without any experience of books or stories, poems or rhymes take years to learn to read, and a few never learn to read at all, which is why even in our country, which has a so-called high literacy rate, we do have an illiteracy rate of about 20%. That means, you know, they can probably function at a very low level. But when they're older, they can't function well enough to get the jobs that they would like to have. Having said all of this, you know, it's never too late to improve a child's life. No, it's never too late to read aloud to children and to help them get along. This is something that makes me cry. A recent study in England claims that parents are reading aloud to their children 40% less than they used to. 40% less than they did 10 years ago, which is really scary. Even though reading aloud to children long before they go to school has been linked positively to IQ development, the development of the imagination, and the ability to talk fluently. Even though people know that, they say, I haven't got time, we're too busy. A Swedish study has revealed that reading aloud to children before school is known to increase employment prospects in later life and even to reduce unwanted pregnancies and crime due to the raising of people's levels of education and raising their expectations of what life might have to offer. Because they can read. Somewhere in here, and I've lost it. I should have said this, but oh yes, here it is. A great deal of expense. It's very expensive building and maintaining prisons and prisoners. If only we could say to our legislators, beloved legislators, if you want to save a great deal of money in this world to build a fair and happy society in which people are more equal than unequal and in which people have, you know, are able to pursue happiness and a good life, perhaps you would like to spend a lot of money at this end of their lives instead of a lot of money at this end of their lives, because the amount of money we spend here will be more than the amount of money we spend here. And little kids need to have that money spent on them. After all, you know, this reading aloud stuff is completely delightful. It is not like taking a kid to a clinic and getting a shot for measles or polio or anything. But what we're doing by reading aloud to them is inoculating them against the disease of illiteracy. It is an inoculation, but it is a delightful inoculation. I mean, kids absolutely adore being read aloud to. They love it. They just adore it. This is a story that's in my book. Well, a lot of this is in my book. This is a précis of my book, this speech. That doesn't mean to say you don't have to buy it afterwards, because there are lots of details that you'll enjoy, okay? I've completely lost my train of thought because I was so silly. Where was I going? This story's inside my book about a kid who loved reading, okay? He's a little boy, and this is a true story told to me by an absolutely wonderful teacher in Illinois. The child's name is not his name, simply because I can't remember what his name was in the story. I just can't remember. But I haven't put any real names in the book anyway. Let's call him Jonas. That's what I called him in the book. He was in, I think it must be a Head Start program or something like that. And this woman had taught this program for 30 years with great success. She loved these kids, and they loved her. She just adored it. And she read to them a lot. One of her main methods of teaching these kids was to read aloud and read aloud and read aloud. Day after day after day, she read aloud. And she did it because she saw that it made the kids happy, it made the kids clever, and it also calmed them down when they were upset about things. You know, when there'd been a big, you know, dust up in the playground, you know, kids were unhappy, or things that happened at home. She realized that reading aloud calmed them. So when they were climbing the walls, she would start reading, and the kids would come and sit on the mat one by one, one after another, and just sit there, and she'd calmly read to them and soothe them with the rhythm of the story and the magic of the words. One day, this little kid called Jonas, who idolized his teacher, loved the way he read aloud to her, he thought that was fantastic. And he was a good kid, she said. He was a nice little boy, but he was so severely provoked by another child that he dug a pencil into the child's arm, and when the pencil was pulled out, the lead stayed there. Okay? So she said, she described it to me as she said, I got my talons on this child, whom I really liked. He'd never misbehaved like this before, and I never took children to the principal. I put my talons on him, and I frog-marched him down to the principal's office, which I never usually did. She said the other kids were shocked into deep silence by the fact that she left the room with this child. Anyway, of course, he started to cry. He was sobbing his heart out. He was full of remorse, poor little thing. And when they got to the principal's office, she said, Jonas, you know, you've done a very bad thing. And she told the principal what he had done. She said, now I want you to choose the punishment. You must choose the punishment because you've done a very bad thing. He's howling, he's sobbing, and the principal says, come on, Jonas, you know, what's this going to be? You've done a bad thing. You have to have a bad thing happen to you. You choose what is a bad thing that would happen to you. And through his sobs, he said, I guess you could stop reading aloud to me. That was the worst thing that could happen to him. Isn't that adorable? It's such a beautiful story. Kids love being read aloud to, and it does them so much good. It really, really does. Let me flick through my notes, because I think I've said almost everything that I really, really want to say. Oh, no, I haven't. One of the things that works, this reading miracle. In fact, I called the book for the first 25 drafts, The Read Aloud Miracle. I called the book The Read Aloud Miracle. But Jim Trelease, who's a good friend of mine and to whom I've dedicated the book, has the Read Aloud Handbook, and it was going to be too confusing because he has a new edition of the Read Aloud Handbook out now. You know, and you can't have the Read Aloud Handbook and the Read Aloud Miracle because people will be buying the wrong book. You know, they'll be buying his and I'll be buying, you know, and so on and so forth. I called it, in the end, Reading Magic because I wrote it. My most famous kids' book in Australia is called Possum Magic. So Reading Magic has a resonance. People recognize me from that book. Yes, the relationship is what I want to talk about between us and children, not the method. You know how I said kids learn to read by many different methods? Most kids learn to read by whatever method they're taught, some more happily and easily than others, but most kids learn to read. But it's the relationship between the teacher and the taught that has the most magnificent effect. A couple of years ago, actually it was 93, so that's nearly ages ago, I was asked to talk on television about the importance of reading aloud to kids. And they wanted me to talk to two parents, you know, father and a mother who never read aloud to their 3-year-old child. And I said, okay. And then the night before they said, no, Mem, actually we've changed our minds. We don't want you to talk to the parents about the importance of reading aloud to children. We would like you to read aloud to the child. Demonstrate reading aloud to the child. Demonstrate the tenderness, the interaction, the coming together of parent and child. I said, I can't do this, it's false, you know. A parent has bonded with a child. How can I demonstrate this? Anyway, they forced me to. So this kid's name was Ben. Actually, it wasn't, but I can't remember what his real name was. I called him Ben in the book. I did take Ben out of the car. I said hello to him first, and I gave him a copy of my poster, Time for Bed, and I gave him a copy of the book, Time for Bed, and then we sat on his sitting room floor, and I started to read to him. And then I read with him, and then he read to me, and all this happened in 15 minutes. But, of course, he wasn't really reading. He was on the way to reading. I thought how preposterous. Nobody in the world would ever claim that. And if they did, they'd need to be hung, drawn, and quartered, because it doesn't happen like that, you know, it just doesn't. I was just furious. I was so upset. But it is true, of course, that I read to him, I read with him, and then he read to me, because we read the same repetitive books over and over again. In 15 minutes, we'd read these 3 books, all of which had rhyme, rhythm, and repetition, and the farm animals. They all had the same farm animals in them. It's time for bed, little mouse, darkness is falling all over the house. It's time for bed, little goose, the stars are out and on the loose. It's time for bed, little cat, so snuggle in tight, that's right, like that. It's time for bed, little calf, what happened today that made you laugh? It's time for bed, etc., 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 etc. Okay, so I read, I never play with a book the first time. I never play with it. I only read it. And if the child tries to interrupt, I say, not now, I'm reading the story. They can interrupt on the second time. I can interrupt on the third time. The first time, no interruptions, no tricks, no teaching. Nothing. I never say to the kids, what do you think this book might be about? It says time for bed. I tell them. Say, this book is called Time for Bed. I'll show you. Look, watch my finger. Time for bed. And this is how it goes. It's time for bed, little mouse. And I read it. Do we have a normal-sized copy of Time for... Oh, we do, because I play this joke, and I did it with him, and he howled with laughter. He laughed and laughed. Here it is. Thank you. Look at this. Watch my finger. I often say, watch my finger. Because I do want kids to attend to print. You know, print is phonics. They have to have it. Okay. Time for bed, it says. Ben, what's the name of this book, sweetie? But the frenzy was there, and then he kept doing it. You know, is it any wonder? And he could do it, even though he was only 3 and I'd only just met him, because he was having a good time. It's no wonder he was relaxed enough to begin to learn to read. He was nowhere near reading. He was beginning to learn to read. It was his first step, you know, and I would have eventually, had I been his mother, I would have been saying, well, you finish it, I'll start, it's time for bed, little cat, and hope that the child says little cat. Okay? And then I'd say it's time for bed, little cat, so snuggle in, right, tight, that's right, like, kids can't help themselves, they say that. They cannot help themselves. When you get to this page, you don't even have to say this page. So I would let them finish the sentences after a while, and then I'd say the kid was called, let's say the kid was called Ben, because he was. I might be reading the book, just reading it, turning the pages over, just doing it in a warm and loving fashion, and then I might go, bed, bed, Ben, 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 Ben. Bed sounds like your name. There's only one letter different. That's bed. Your name's Ben. All we have to change is the D to the end. I'll show you, I'll write it down. You almost know how to read your name, because bed's almost like your name. You know, it's game playing. It is never something that can be curriculumized, because it's what's happening with your kid, with that book at that moment only. It's not happening with anybody else's kid in the world at that moment. It's between you, your child, and the book at that moment. It's just something that we think of. And I try to explain in the book what the type of game, because it's not teaching, it's literally not teaching, but it is making kids aware of what's on the page. Playing games with what we see on the page. So there is a chapter which says in my book, getting the most out of a read aloud session, because, you know, we can just read aloud and that's perfectly fine. It's just fine. But if we can read aloud a little bit and do a little bit of extra stuff, that's wonderful. Of course, when we're reading aloud to them, we're also talking to them about what we're reading aloud. There's a wonderful speech pathologist group in my city, and they're running a program called Babies Need Books, Like Books Too. Babies Like Books Too. Because they are having increasingly 4-year-olds who are coming to them unable to speak. Because their parents have thought that sitting in front of the television provided them with enough language to learn English. But they never engage in a conversation. And because they don't engage in conversation, they end up with a speech pathologist at the age of 4 saying, you know, my child isn't talking and he's 4. Is there anything wrong? Well, do you talk to him, they say? And they're not talking to him because they don't know what to say, because they think they can't have a conversation with somebody who can't reply. Shame, isn't it? It's a pitiful shame. So the way that the Babies Need Books Too people are working with parents is by saying, look, if you can't talk to your children, and talking makes them bright, talking makes them clever, if you can't talk to them and you're embarrassed to talk to them, then read aloud to them and talk about the book and say, whoa, what's happening? Whoa, look what's happening in this picture. What's going on? So you're talking about the book because you're talking about something, but you can then question and discuss with your child and say, oh, that looks like the pirate in that other book that we read. So you're comparing and contrasting and doing all the things that kids need to have to get their brains and language going. Because, you know, to read well, we need to have an understanding of print, the first thing. We must understand print. We must understand language. It's very difficult for anybody who speaks English to read Chinese. We must understand language, and we absolutely have to understand how the world works. Because if we don't understand that in a story, somebody who is bad is going to be punished, if we don't understand that, we're going to find the story difficult to read. We're waiting, we're expecting that this person is going to be punished, and they're certainly going to be punished because they've been bad. We need to know how the world works in many ways in order to be able to learn to read. Those of you who are studying at the moment know that the first time you meet something, it's extremely difficult to read it. You know, if it's in an article and it's a new subject you're studying, you think, I don't understand this, I don't get it. By the end of the semester, you can't understand why you didn't get it. It's because you understand more of the world of that article. You understand the world of it, and it's much easier to read. So, where do we go from here? Do I have another thing left to say except my happy story? I have a nice little story here, also in the book. My hairdresser's daughter, Tiffy. She's a sassy little piece of dynamite, this kid, I'm telling you. She's so sassy. She was reading aloud to her entire neighborhood at the age of just 6. Well, you know, I would be hoping that in Australia we start school at 5, real school at 5, and by the end of the year that the kids turn 6, we start to panic if they can't read, so they get a little bit of extra help. But this kid was reading. She was reading chapter books at this point, and she was going around the neighborhood and reading to the kids. And everybody said to the mother, "Oh, you must have taught her to read. You must have taught her. She's so far ahead. This is incredible." And the mother said, "Taught her to read? You must be joking. I'm a hairdresser. I couldn't teach her how to read. I'd be petrified. I'd do something wrong and really mess her life up. I didn't teach her to read." So they said, "Well, what did you do then?" "Well, I just read aloud to her," they say. People do not believe it. You say read aloud. It sounds so simple. It sounds such a pathetic little way of passing the time pleasantly. People do not realize the educative nature of reading aloud. There's so much that happens when we read aloud. If we need knowledge of print, knowledge of language, and knowledge of the world in order to read well, where do we get it from? We get it from reading as well as from living. We actually get it from reading. We get the print from reading. We get the knowledge of the world from reading. We get the knowledge of language from reading. So reading of itself helps reading get better, as it is with us. You know? I couldn't read Dostoevsky's... it wasn't Dostoevsky, it was Tolstoy's War and Peace. I couldn't read it. I had never read it, even as an adult. I saw 3 episodes on the television, and I got the world of it. I got the world of it. And I got the names of it. I got the language of the names, you know, because the names at the beginning of War and Peace drive you crazy because they change all the time. The same person has several different names depending on who's talking to them. And once I got the world and the names, the language of it, I thought, I can't wait for the next episodes. I can't be waiting. Yeah, I can't watch 26 episodes of War and Peace. I haven't got time. So I read it, and it was so easy then for me to read. I found it so enjoyable because I had had that kind of introduction, you know, where the difficulty of the beginning had been taken away. So when we're reading with kids, instead of saying straight, well, I'd never get a kid, I don't think I'd ever get a child to read something first off blindly, especially if they were a failing child, because they'd fail again. If we were going to read to a child and ask them to read to us, say, although I don't like failing kids to read aloud, because they fail and fail and fail again. But if we were going to ask them to read aloud, I'd always read them a bit of the story first, so that they get over the names, they get a bit of the world of the story, and then they're much better on their way. And if they're finding it a little bit difficult, then you read a bit, so that then they can read a little bit, and then they can, and then swap, you know, and always keep the story going and keep the kids happy. Last story, my last story to finish with. I hope I've said my major points. They're all in my book, of course. But this is the last story. This is the opposite story of the story I started with Mackie. You know, I started with Mackie, my own great-nephew, poor little sod. Anyway, this is a happy story. A man, it was the father who wrote to me. I was on television yet again talking about reading aloud because it has been a bit of a broken record with me for the past 20 years. And he sent me a website message, which is probably still there on my website somewhere. The website is .net, memfox.net, not .com. And he said, I saw you on the television tonight talking about the importance of reading aloud to children, and I want to tell you about what happened to our own child, Justin. Justin, when he wrote to me, was 21 months old. It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story. I've précised it in my notes. It's in full in the book, but even in the book, it's only a short story. But this is how it goes. This is page 8. I need page 10 probably, and 11. Yes, because that's the end of my little talk. Good. He and his wife Donna had read aloud regularly to their son with remarkable results. Justin had been introduced to books at 6 days old because his parents seemed to think that that was a nice thing to do. Yes, and it's rather boring looking after babies all the time unless you cheer yourself up. So they read to him, and he liked them right from the start. From day to day and week to week, according to them, his enjoyment of books grew steadily. He knew clearly which way a book should be held, and he could even turn the pages on cue, responding to the obvious pause in the reading at the end of a page, and he could do this by 3 months. Could turn the page in a book by 3 months, because he'd been read so many books. Before long, he was developing favourites, most of which had simple rhyming words and moving pieces like the spot books, you know, the flap books, that fascinated him. By 6 months, he could identify many of his books by pointing to the title on the cover. And he was becoming more and more aware of tracking the print from left to right. In fact, I've seen a video of him tracking print at 6 months. It's extraordinary. He can't read the print, but he's aware that that's what you sort of are doing, you know, because he sees his parents doing it. He was able soon to say 2 or 3 words together on a regular basis. He also attempted to read along with his parents when they were reading to him, and he filled in the gaps. He tried to fill in the gaps. He couldn't speak. He tried to fill in the gaps that they left out of certain sentences. And he knew his books in his ear, not his mouth, virtually off by heart. They knew that he knew them off by heart. At 21 months, this very young child had a speaking vocabulary in excess of 500 words. At 21 months. Now, my feeling when I got this website message was, why didn't the mother get a life? Fancy counting your child's vocabulary. What kind of a mother is that, you know? I was horrified. I thought, this is dreadful behaviour. You know, this is not a natural child rearing. You know, this is ridiculous. You know, what mother counts, you know, the number of words and ticks them off and says, well, I've already ticked that one, so it must be the new one. I mean, my God. Anyway, I suppose I was furious because my own daughter only learnt to talk at 2.5 because she couldn't get a word in edgeways, basically. So Justin's learning was coincidental, you know. It was fun. His parents didn't do anything super special with him at all, except love him, play with him, read to him, and provide him with plenty of books and the time to enjoy them. Now, you can tell that I did not like these parents. I met them on the book tour for this book in Australia when I went to their city, which is Melbourne. They were charming. They were just ordinary. They weren't yuppie, pushy, competitive, horrible people. They were just a delight. And their little boy wasn't a brat. He was just a sweetheart. You know, they were just, I loved meeting them because it made me realize that what they were saying was totally true, that they just hadn't been pushing and, you know, and teaching and this kid's got to be ahead. They weren't doing that. They were just having fun with him. Now, my feeling is that Justin could be anyone's child, almost anyone, given health of parents, okay, given the health and so on. Justin could be anyone's child, your child, my child, or the little kid next door. Justin wasn't born gifted, remember. He only had 25% of his brain developed. He wasn't born gifted, so he isn't gifted, but he will now be called gifted at school. Needless to say, the school will call him gifted. My point is that every child has a chance to be a Justin in the same way as every chance has a child to be a Mackie, has a chance to be a Mackie. And which one would we want for our children? Which one would we want, to be Justin or to be Mackie? Justin isn't gifted, he isn't special, he's normal. But he does have an incredible blessing in his life, parents who read aloud to him. Can we bestow a similar blessing, I wonder, on all the children in our own lives? Thank you. Thank you for having me. I think we can go and have something to eat and drink, can't we?